His name is Dr. Jeffrey Guss, and he's a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst with a specialty in addictive disorders and psychotherapy. He is co-principal investigator and the director of therapist training for the NYU Psilocybin Cancer Anxiety Project. Dr. Guss is developing a model for training therapists for cancer-related therapy trials, as well as imagining clinical practice with psilocybin-assisted therapy. He maintains a psychotherapy-based practice in New York City. Dr. Guss is a graduate of the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. It's wonderful that we have him here with us tonight. Please welcome him. Dr. Jeffrey Guss.
Okay, how's the sound?
Very good.
Good? Okay. So we're going to have 80% of the slides, a little bit cut off, but I'll have to ask your indulgence. All the careful arrangement is now going to be shifted to the side. So I want to ask the question tonight, psychedelic therapy, a treatment in search of a disorder. What is psychedelic therapy? What does it treat? And how does it help people? This is a question that came to me when I first was asked to be the director of psychedelic therapy training by Steve Ross, and it's something that I still don't feel like I have a clear answer to. And I think it's something that's going to evolve over the next couple of decades or longer in terms of what psychedelic therapy is and what it treats. But I want to take all these questions tonight in a particular way by looking at the role of intoxication and dissociation in psychedelic therapy. I'm going to draw on the experiences that I've had in working in the NYU Cancer Anxiety Project over the last 8 years or so. But I want to bring my experience as a clinical psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, but also my work with ayahuasca and ayahuasca shamanism. So I hope to try to weave these three worlds together, at least in a preliminary way, and raise some questions and offer some ideas on how we might look at things in a cross-cultural way. So before I go any further, I want to say express some appreciation. First to Janice Phelps, who you have all met, who has done what I considered to be the impossible when I when I heard about it. Bringing together so many people, so many students, in such a elegant and intellectually rigorous and gracious way. So I cannot express my gratitude and amazement at her achievement too much. Next, the group of people at Johns Hopkins and NYU and Hefter, who have done so much to be welcoming to me and make the NYU Cancer Anxiety Project go forward. Tonight I'm going to be drawing on some really impressive, smart, creative writers. Stanley Krippner, who's written extensively on shamanism, and I've taken some of my talk from this paper by him. Roger Walsh, who I'm sure many of you know, and Michael Winkelman, who's written such interesting articles. And last but not least, James Lahr, who is a provost of Druid College and an ayahuasca curandero, a pipe carrier, but most of all, the best boyfriend ever in the world. He's right here. So as I'm sure some of you know, at NYU and Johns Hopkins, UCLA, and University of Wisconsin, we conduct research on the use of psilocybin-assisted therapy in randomized clinical trials. But it's not really this kind of work that is most interesting to me, or is at the heart of what I do, although it accounts for my being here tonight. I'm a clinical psychiatrist, I'm trained in psychoanalysis, and I have a full-time practice in New York City where I do psychotherapy all day long. This is my practice in Midtown. So I'm not really a researcher at heart. I sort of became one because of the psychedelic research emerging at NYU. And I don't think I'd be doing research at all if it weren't for being involved in psychedelics. So I'm a bit of an anomaly as far as psychiatrists go. I'm not primarily a medication prescriber, although I do that in clinical situations when it's necessary. But I did psychoanalytic training here at the NYU postdoctoral program. And I'm not a Freudian. I don't practice a blank screen model. I'm much more of a relational, intersubjective kind of clinician, and I hope that psychoanalysis and psychotherapy can really help open up our patients' ability to think and to feel and to expand what life can mean. And in this sense, I think that what I do during the day has some really core similarities with psychedelic therapy and shamanic therapy as well. So my project for tonight, how to bring the world of psychedelic therapy and clinical psychiatry with the world of indigenous shamanism, and really what can we learn, what must we learn from ayahuasca shamanism? How do we weave these two worlds together? How do we educate people who are unfamiliar with psychedelic therapy as to how it works, who it will benefit, and what it can really mean? So I'm going to start by looking, as I said, at these two processes. Dissociation and intoxication. And these are the images that symbolize intoxication and dissociation, and they're going to come up again and again in the talk. So we don't really talk about intoxication and dissociation in shamanism, but these are descriptive terms from Western psychology, but certainly they are there, and they're very much present nonetheless. So I developed some of the core ideas for tonight's talk when I was recruiting patients for our study at the NYU Cancer Center with Gabby Egan-Liebes, who I'm sure some of you know here. You know, we had only a few minutes to make our pitch when we were trying to recruit patients. We started off trying to speak to doctors and give talks to them and explain to them what the research was like, and they would go, oh yes, okay, we're interested and we'll send you patients, but they never did. So we had to go into the cancer center, speak with nurses, speak with social workers, ask them who was anxious, who wasn't on an SSRI, and speak with family members, and we tried to see 10 or 12 people a day to make our pitch for our study. And it was tough to meaningfully convey what joining the study might really be like for them. You know, in straightforward language that wasn't filled with jargon and didn't have flowery promises of spiritual transformation. You know, I wanted to describe psychedelic healing to the doctors, the therapists, the patients that were in treatment there and their families who were not already believers. And this is just another picture showing, you know, what it looked like. This is really what the Cancer Anxiety Center looked like. People in big Naga-high chairs, receiving chemotherapy, receiving radiation therapy, looking scared, looking frantic, looking spaced out, and you know, really quite unhappy. So I wanted find a way to speak with all the clinicians and the infusion nurses that didn't seem new agey or fringy or countercultural. I didn't want it to seem like we were trying to peddle some new druggy religion or some kind of magical mystery tour. And I wanted to have really solid, dynamic explanations for how psychedelic therapy works. And the doctors and nurses would ask really good questions that were tough to answer succinctly. How do you know they aren't just getting high and having big fantasies? What makes it last after they come down? Won't they need to keep taking it again and again? Aren't they really just avoiding reality and relying on a quick fix? And I felt like I didn't have really great answers for that. And the most difficult question I had trouble finding a fast sort of soundbite answer for was, how does it work? I wanted to find a way to describe it in humanist psychodynamic terms, because I thought that it would communicate the most clearly to people without necessarily tapping into a spiritual or into a biomedical model. But first, an aside. You know, I'm making a pitch for psychedelic therapy for non-believers and people who really didn't know anything about it, people who hadn't heard anything about psychedelic mushrooms. But when we were at the Cancer Center, there was another kind of experience that happened. You know, we spoke with people, all kinds of people, and sometimes they would get really quiet and giddy and tell us that they knew exactly what we were talking about. And they would get kind of looking over their shoulders, worried that somebody might see them. And they would say, you know, like, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I could say, oh, that would really be helpful. And they'd look around to make certain that other people couldn't hear what they were saying. They'd lower their voices and tell me that their past experiences with psychedelics were the most intense, meaningful experiences in their lives. And a lot of times they tell me they had not talked about this for decades with anybody, and how they were excited they were to be able to talk with somebody about it. But they never could talk to another colleague about it. And there was this quiet, shh, we were not going to talk very loud about it. And there was even fear of speaking in a full voice about these positive memories. Like, they might be caught revealing a forbidden love. And then they would always ask the same question. Do you have any psilocybin you can spare? Or do you know anybody you can hook me up with to get some? Because I don't have cancer, but I think this study would be helpful for me. So you can see my dilemma. We're back to how does it work? It was a hard sell, both to the believers and people who knew nothing about it. And to the believers, it was a hard sell in a different way, because I felt like I didn't have a solid psychodynamic explanation for how I thought people with cancer anxiety would get better from taking a psilocybin journey. So I thought, we have randomized clinical trials, we have a 100-page protocol, and it's chock full of information and figures and explanations, and yet in these documents, there really isn't a good explanation for how to explain in dynamic terms or in simple sort of humanist terms how psychodynamic therapy works. So randomized clinical trials are designed to prove something. They're designed to prove that psychedelics work, that they help people, and that they are safe. You select participants, you evaluate them carefully, you run them through your protocol, and then they approve or they don't improve. But usually they improve according to your questionnaires and what you expect to happen. So it's very outcome-oriented. Research shows that psychedelics work. But how do they work? There's two primary models that we use to answer this question in our research. And in my opinion, they are incomplete. The incomplete answers to this question. I want to emphasize that I am not saying that either one of these models is incorrect. I just believe that it's an incomplete explanation for how psychodynamic therapy works. And they both fall short of providing the narrative that I was looking for. So these two models are the magic bullet and the magic box. Let's take a look at them one at a time. The magic bullet is a term that was coined by Paul Ehrlich, who was a physician in the early 20th century, who described antibodies and later a drug that treated syphilis. And that's where the term the magic bullet came from. But the magic bullet sees psychiatric medicines as a rediscovered magical molecule that does something fantastically amazing to the brain. The players in this model are neurotransmitters, receptors, brain circuitry, psychopharmacologists, and neuroscientists. With the magic bullet model, our research involves extremely expensive machines in order to see very teeny tiny things that you can't see with the naked eye, or things that have to be computed in a very fantastically sophisticated computer program taken from an fMRI pattern with pyramidal cells, altered EEG patterns, things that are invisible without these machines at computer-driven analysis. So we would look for patterns of neurons firing or areas of the brain that are connected in a certain way or getting more glucose or less glucose to them. And researching psychedelics in this way is very important. I am not questioning that at all, in spite of the little bit of sarcasm that I'm bringing to it. But at a clinical level, this narrative, psilocybin is a newly rediscovered magic bullet. The magic bullet for 20th century penicillin. An amazing drug now available to do battle against treatment-resistant depression, against cluster headaches, against obsessive-compulsive disorder. So again, I am not saying that these molecules won't succeed in helping people who have these conditions. Far from it. I believe that we will find much of this research is fruitful and shows that these hopes are well-founded. But the magic bullet model is a brain-based mechanistic model. And there is no self present that undergoes treatment. There is a disordered brain and a special molecule that we administer to repair what's messed up. So the clinician here is working in a strictly psychopharmacological model. You give the medicine, you monitor for safety, you track the patient's progress, and you write notes about it. Again, I am not saying that this is an inappropriate model to use for some patients. I just don't think that it helps us explain how psychedelic therapy works. So my next critique might not seem as problematic, but I think it contains, again, some limitations. And this is the magic box model. The magic box model sees psychedelic medicines as a means for conveying the patient to a magical land known as a mystical state. With this powerful medicine, you travel to this very unique state for a few hours, and something super special, super fantastic happens to you there. And you get to stay for a while, and then when you come home, you're different than you were before, and you have your memories. Now, in this model, the doctor is like a pilot on the plane, way off at another place, invisible, but driving the whole thing. And the psychedelic therapist is a flight attendant who helps you get on and off the plane, makes sure that you're comfortable during your flight, and brings you a glass of water or a blanket if you need that. On rare occasions, if something really bad happens, the flight attendant is the person that helps you keep your shit together so you don't crash and burn. And again, this is a little bit of a snarky model, but there is a way that I hear sometimes people speaking about psychedelic therapy as holding back, not being very much of a presence in the room, and intervening only when necessary. As if the person is best left alone. And I want to challenge that and speak towards a real strong presence of the therapist in the room, not necessarily talking a lot or doing a lot, but seeing his or her impact profoundly influencing all aspects of how the therapy works. And that, to me, is what makes psychedelic therapy, and not being a sitter or a guide, so more like somebody who'd be like a lifeguard sitting on the edge of the beach while you swim. You're on your own. If something bad happens, they'll come get you. I think that the therapist has a much more central role in creating the experience, holding it, and interpreting afterwards. And that's what makes it psychedelic therapy and not some form of psychedelic healing. Okay. So again, we asked the question, how does it work? So here we have a bare bones description of the therapeutic encounter that was offered by E. Fuller Torrey, who some of you may know, a very interesting writer. And his description of the psychotherapeutic encounter across cultures is as follows, although I added a few things. A person suffers, or a community marks that person as suffering. That person seeks help from a community-sanctioned healer. The suffering is understood or narrated in a shared way between the sufferer and the healer. What is my problem? How did I come to have it? And how do I escape from this internal torment? So the sufferer and the healer have some shared model, some shared narrative for what it's about and what's going to happen. Then treatment happens, and the healer is in charge of keeping the treatment on track. Usually, money or goods change hands, and at the end, the sufferer is changed, hopefully for the better. The culture understands the change that has happened and embraces the healed person in his new condition or her new condition. So first, we're going to tackle intoxication. When you describe this part of psychedelic therapy to clinicians, there are two aspects of the treatment that usually evoke these really strong anxious reactions: intoxication and dissociation. You can call them other names, but that doesn't change their essential nature and their deep association with psychopathology. And in a way, that's going to be the core of the theme that I want to talk about tonight: how intoxication and dissociation are so embedded in pathological processes in Western psychiatry and Western psychoanalytic theory, and how we need to question that. The idea that a state of intense intoxication could be healing is quite foreign in Western psychiatry and psychology. Advocating a medicine that intentionally brings about intense intoxication for the benefit of a patient is really not even a comprehensible notion to most therapists. Doctors get very upset if they think that their patients are getting intoxicated or getting high from the drugs that they prescribe. Adderall for ADHD is fine, but getting a buzz from the Adderall, very, very bad. No, doctors prescribing substances that intentionally evoke intoxication is going to be a very tough sell. You should see the fear and the anger that happens when a clinician begins to have the sense that there's some pleasure or intoxication that's coming from a prescription that he or she is giving. Suddenly, the collaboration turns into an animosity, the substance is cut off, the person becomes an evil kind of manipulative grifter who's trying to get something from the doctor, and the doctor becomes quite afraid that he or she is an enabler and doing something harmful, rather than there being some complicated process that's happening. So there's two reasons, there's two main problems that I think are core to why doctors get so flipped out at the idea of intoxication. One is addiction, and the other is pleasure. So we're going to tackle addiction first. By far, what attention is paid to substance intoxication when you're a psychiatrist or a therapist in Western psychology is thinking about addiction. We even have a specialty for it called addictionology. And again, I'm offering a disclaimer. I work in addictions, and I go to addictionology conferences, and I believe that there's much to be learned, and that certainly addiction is a profoundly debilitating condition. But you cannot understand all of intoxication on the basis of addiction. So every clinician is taught to ask these questions when a patient talks about their substance use. Is this person harmfully involved with the substances that they're telling me about? What is this drug doing to my patient's brain? Is my patient harming his or her neurons, depleting their serotonin, overstimulating their dopamine reward system? And what effect is this person's drug use having on his or her personality? It's quite unusual, actually. It's quite unusual, in fact, for a therapist to ask, how does intoxication with a substance possibly help my patient's growth and development? How does drug use help my patient adapt to the world or improve their capacity for empathy or creativity or introspection? How does my patient's intense interest in states of intoxication heal their alienation or their sense of meaninglessness or isolation? And how do intoxication or dissociation help heal my patient? These are questions that we're never taught even to think about in psychiatric training. So this reminds me of a quote that comes from David Smith, who is was the founder of the Haight-Ashbury Medical Clinic in the mid-60s. These are some journals that he published before the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs became the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs. Now, Smith likened being an addictionologist to being an orthopedic surgeon at a ski resort. There are hundreds of people engaging in a sport that can be quite dangerous and can result in quite serious, significant casualties. And if you're an orthopedic surgeon at such a setting, all you see are the casualties and harm every day. It would make you wonder why anybody would actually take the risks of skiing in the first place, given the obvious dangers to it. And it might make you very skeptical about the thrills and chills and excitement that people report to you from why they do it. And you might think, well, I wonder if they have some death wish, or if they really are masochists, or if there's some high-risk profile that this person has that would lead them to do this. And you'd never understand the point of skiing or what people can get from skiing if you yourself had not skied. And if you hadn't, then you might never, ever think, well, that's something that I would like to try or understand it. So the problem in psychiatry is that we have no meaningful, convincing theory for talking about adaptive benefits of intoxication. Most of the time, when a clinician discovers that their patient is not harmfully involved with substances, they drop their interest in their intoxication altogether. And whether they have a glass of wine or two at dinner, or smoke some pot, or do whatever it is that they like to do, if it's not a problem, the interest in it, in psychotherapy, goes down. And then if your patient suddenly becomes highly interested in a certain kind of intoxication, then the only kind of flags that come up are flags about addiction. Over-reliance on a substance as opposed to self-reliance, or reliance on a medication that the doctor has prescribed and is regulated by the doctor and by the state, raises concerns about addiction. So here's a nice graphic of David Smith in the middle, looking as he looks now. Okay, so in indigenous shamanism, intoxication is held in a very, very different way. The state of intoxication for both the shaman and the ill person is a technology for entering into states of consciousness that are socially supported and understood as therapeutic, both for the shaman and for the ill person. Rather than being antisocial, the intoxication has a pro-social function that serves the individual and the community. The shaman and sometimes the seeker use intoxication to enter into a spirit world and to see what cannot be seen otherwise, to gather information and to intervene in a special, beneficial way with forces that are invisible to the sober, non-intoxicated mind. So in this way, intoxication with ayahuasca is not the cause of a problem, it is a means for solving a problem. It is a response to the need to acquire information from another realm of reality. And it comes from a need for otherness, to lose the autobiographical, earthly identified self, to become other, and to identify with spirit, animal, ancestors. Now, we expect our doctors to be sober and attentive and separate from our patients. We do not believe that we can treat in therapy people who are intoxicated. We do not believe that intoxication is a route to valuable information about our patients' problems. And we cannot even begin to suggest out loud that the act of the doctor taking the intoxicating substance with the patient might be the best way to approach the therapeutic encounter. What stands in the way of a conversation about intentional intoxication having a therapeutic, salubrious effect? The chief problem here is this. We can imagine that we can understand all drug abuse and addiction all drug use from understanding addiction. The basic stance is that all intoxication is part of a slippery slope. It's just that the non-problematic user isn't on a very slippery part of the slippery slope. He still or she still is there, they just haven't gotten to the slippery part yet. The healthy path for anyone is to use substances less, to develop other defenses, and to rely on one's self and other people for stability, for insight, and for growth. So the message is it's best to get off the slope altogether. Here we see sobriety, intoxication, and addiction all on a continuum. And I'm offering the idea that we need to develop a model for intoxication that is not based in the models of understanding addicts. So when I first wrote this talk, I went into some detail about the self-medication hypothesis and harm reduction and motivational interviewing, because each one in its way has, I think, subtle, wise, and really creative ways to understand addiction. But each of them is embedded in a model of pathology and deficit or lack. So the substance use is seen and understood in that context. And I think that is quite limiting in terms of the project that we're undertaking tonight. So a needle exchange program will help prevent HIV and hepatitis transmission, but it does not ask about the meaning of opiate intoxication in any psychological way for the person that's involved. And this is far from providing help to us in advancing our case for how intoxication can be therapeutic. Again, harm reduction therapy, Andrew Tatarsky, Alan Marlatt, and Miller and Rolnick, all of whom have written such useful books. Okay. So one perspective that I would like to move this question to takes us back to the twinkling look in the eyes of the people at the NYU Cancer Center that I mentioned to my colleagues at the beginning of the talk. This intensely profound, meaningful effects that they experienced, and they were suffused by something that was almost unspeakable in the conversation, and that is pleasure. And for psychedelics, this is not the everyday pleasures of food or sex or even alcohol. My colleagues' experiences with psychedelics were remembered as a very intense pleasure that was unforgettable and almost mythic in scope. And here we have a huge problem, because in our culture, we have a massive ambivalence regarding pleasure. We're fascinated by it, and we mistrust it. We seek it, and we condemn it. We're afraid of it, because we fear it can be overwhelming or can swallow us up. and we divide pleasure into acceptable and unacceptable categories. We have moral judgments about the way that we enjoy our own pleasure or how other people do. A person puts itself at risk to say in public, psychedelic medicines are among the most intensely pleasurable experiences of my life. The sensual expansion of consciousness that these medicines can bring about is often held in deep, deep suspicion by many who have not experienced it. And this pleasure is seen as illusory and fanciful and childish. We bring so much more attention in psychiatry and psychology to suffering. And to be more rhetorically sophisticated, I'd like to say that pleasure is under-theorized in clinical psychiatry and psychology. Pleasure is often reduced to hedonism, or it's reduced to a brain's process that focuses on dopamine and the reward center, the amygdala, the brain. There are wholesome pleasures, of course, nature, playing with the baby, fresh blueberries, but no type of pleasure that comes from intoxicants has a narrative that is affirming or encouraging. So we have a challenge trying to blast through these two roadblocks, pleasure and intoxication, in terms of speaking with Western psychologists, psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, to make some gravel that we can walk on. So I'd like to take a turn to talk about some writing by a very interesting anthropologist named Cameron Duff. Some very smart thinking on the subject comes from the world of public health and epidemiology, rather than the world of psychiatry and psychology. So I want to introduce you to Cameron Duff, who's written a number of papers, several of which I like to teach when I teach the Addiction Fellows. He's from Melbourne, Australia, and is a professor of medical anthropology at RMIT, and written extensively on the question of drug use and pleasure. So these are the two papers that I'm going to be drawing some of my ideas from: Pleasure in Context, the International Journal of Drug Policy, and Drug Use as a Practice of the Self, the Ethics of Moderation. Is there a place for the ethics of moderation? So Duff has published these two papers, and I'm going to introduce some ideas from. He studies, as an anthropologist, he studies populations in their natural habitat in order to learn about the world from the outside in, rather than coming with clinical problems or theories that he's looking for validation of. He looks and talks to people about how their world is and what they do and why they do it and what they have to say about it. Anthropologists are not required to be therapeutic. They ask questions, they listen to the answers, and without an agenda to change anything, just to understand. So Duff talked with young adults who were club kids in Melbourne, Australia, about why they took ecstasy and amphetamines. He conducted this research in order to contribute to the development of rational drug policy in Australia regarding club drugs. He noted how well delineated in harm reduction writing and harm reduction discourse in Australia risks and dangers were, and how prevalent they were in in the writing and theory about how to do harm reduction, but how meager the writing was on pleasure was. There was recognition of pleasure, but he noted that it was understood in quite a simple-minded way. So he observed that in drug policy literature, the word pleasure seemed to be the final word on why people would use club drugs. As if saying, well, they derived pleasure from it is the end of the thought, the end of the paragraph, and a complete understanding of it. And that what you're trying to do is figure out how to, get people to not have so much pleasure or to use it in a safer way. But he found that it was not very effective at motivating people to change their behavior. And this is so true when you look at any kind of behavioral change. You try to look at condom use or needles exchange in terms of preventing HIV transmission. Stacking up the negatives and trying to scare people about what bad is going to happen to them is not the only way, and in many ways not the best and most effective way to get them to change their behavior. So he saw that ultimately in psychiatric discourse, pleasure is reduced to a brain event. When you look at addictions, you see the person in some ways removed from the story, and the brain becomes this hijacked brain that has been taken over by the drug. Sometimes when you're speaking with addiction clinicians, they'll say, well, during the first 6 months of treatment, you're just talking to the neurons. So the person is gone. What you're talking to is a drug craving, drug delivery system. And what you hear, what the person says, is nothing that you really want to take a lot of stock in. So the human being is vanished in this discourse. So certainly this neuroscientific model of pleasure and addiction is not under-theorized in psychiatry, but the existential meaning of pleasure is the ways that pleasure can expand the self and the pleasure that comes from expanding the self. These are not part of our narrative of intoxication. And so if a person becomes highly interested in this particular type of pleasure, especially the pleasure of consciousness expansion and consciousness transformation, alarm bells go off. So I'm going to give you a kind of cliff notes on what Duff has to say about pleasure and how he sort of expanded the thinking and the narrative around pleasure. And I hope that as I do, you'll think about each of these types of pleasure in terms of psychedelic therapy that you've conducted and the context in which this pleasure happens. Because I think until we are able to talk about intoxication, bringing about something pleasurable and valuable, we're going to have a hard time talking with our clinicians about it. So Duff talks about 3 types of practices. And again, this idea comes from Michel Foucault, in which he talks about practices of the self. Rather than there being a core inside that generates behavior, the Foucauldian principle is that practices and behaviors construct the self, and that the self is constructed through one behavior after another, and the meaning of those behaviors. And that accounts for the graphic that I have at the bottom of the slide. So Duff talks about the pleasure in practice, which is what one does, the pleasure in space, which is where one is, and the pleasure in the body, which is how one's body feels. And there's Cameron again. So the pleasure in practice, what one does. For these club kids, dancing, it was dancing on ecstasy. It led them to have a deeper sense of connection and pleasure in their bodies. They experienced dancing in a new way and felt movement, loud music, having sex, meeting strangers, talking to friends, were materially transformed with MDMA on board. They reported a greater feeling of connection to others and a deep sense of self-discovery. And this was not only dopamine-induced pleasure in the same way that you might expect if you had an electrode in your brain that caused the substance to be released and you were doing your ordinary activities. In another paper, Duff talks about moderate drug use as a practice of the self, where it brings about a valued sense of difference in oneself through an intentional action. So you go from one self to an other self, and an otherness is created. Pursuing this change through responsible drug use, he feels, in accordance with Foucault, that this is an ennobling and character-building action, and in some ways is more ennobling and character-building than abstinence or sobriety, which he sees as a kind of self-denial addiction, in some ways parallel with substance addiction itself. So moderation and self-restraint themselves are ennobling in their effect. So this is not an invitation to a bacchanal, but it's about the creation of a different self, seeking this difference and finding a creative aspect of the self through the context of a drug. So back to us, back to psychedelic therapists. We don't see our patients in our study dancing in a club or hanging out or chatting with friends. What are the psychedelic takers in the cancer anxiety study doing? They are pilgrims, they are seeking help. They travel from their homes, they come to our session room riddled with fears about cancer. They've waited a long time for the moment of their session. They arrive, they lie down on the couch, they're held in a very quiet, safe place. They're setting out on a journey of self-exploration, and they participate in rituals of various kinds that we have in our study. They're following a spirit medicine ritual, even though it's embedded in a research center. They change into comfy clothes and get under the covers like they're going to take a nap. They're pioneers in a novel and audacious research study. They bring warrior spirit and a fierce will to live more fully. And they are in relation to their therapists and the room as they do this, not just during the session, but at every moment that we've spent with them, from the initial phone call to the dosing session to the integration sessions. And each one, they with us are creating context, intention, and having a relationship. They ask for illumination and transcendence as they move through our office. And all of this occurs in the altered state of psilocybin consciousness, and it would not be occurring in the same way if that weren't present. So this is the version of going to a club and having a profound experience. This doing, as a person moves through space and they have relationship, we have to understand a way to speak about this as all part of the pleasure that comes from psychedelic therapy. So the next category is, well, this is the pleasure in space. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have I think that this is a Swedish film from the 1960s about an LSD session. This is somebody from Charlie Grove study in the middle. And in the upper right-hand corner is you see the Johns Hopkins study room. So the next type of pleasure is the pleasure in space, which is where one is. The second context for pleasure he talked about is space. He goes at length to talk about the intensity of the music at the rave and the people that were there, and describe these places as having intensive properties. The drug use intensified the experience of the vibes or the energy in the setting. Some of his respondents talked about the expansiveness and the vastness that resulted from the combination of ecstasy and being in nature. This sense of place was intensified by the drug, and the experience of being in nature or being at the rave informed one another, where each contributed something that neither could do alone. And this fundamental energy exists. The energy of space is a defining product of the experience, that it was felt and given meaning by the intoxication effect. And this resulted in a highly meaningful sense of pleasurable self-transformation. So in comparison, let's talk about a psychedelic therapy session, which is quite the opposite. Instead, our place is a comfortable room, a place to be still, to go inward, to breathe, to have emotional support that the therapists offer, to rest on a comfortable sofa with clean sheets and a comfy pillow. Instead of young people enjoying loud music, there are personal photographs or objects that they've brought. They're cut off from the outside world with eye shades. Headphones separate them from us and create music that appears to be coming from the middle of their heads. There are gentle nature photographs on the wall. The room temperature is just right. Sometimes the session room feels like a lovely nursery where a tender, frightened child is being put down for a very special nap and promised a magnificent, sumptuous dream. Well, it's true. There may be elements of nightmares that are present in the dream, but under any circumstances, the intention is for the experience to be affirmed through the act of coming to know the self in this room on this day. And this is a very special type of pleasure, and the meaning of it is embedded in the intention that the person brings. So the last category is the pleasure in the body. His respondents experienced the body differently whether they were when they were taking ecstasy or amphetamines. They reported a radically new set of corporeal sensations. Young adults reported intense pleasure at the heightened perceptions of their bodies and of their emotions. There was a consistent sense of increased intensity of a body sense with startling importance. This heightened state of arousal, even if it was unpleasant, was embedded in the discovery of the self as a new way of being, a new way of experiencing the self, a new way of feeling one's body with new feelings, imaginings, and imagination and perception. It may be difficult for us to imagine the kind of pleasure in the body that we would be supporting and bringing about in patients in psychedelic therapy. We usually don't think or focus on our patients' body experiences, the way the blanket feels or the touch of their skin. But very often we would hear how unbelievably powerful the music was and how profoundly it affected them. And this is a bodily sensation. This openness to being swept away emotionally by music is something that we would hear in our study again and again. Many of our participants reported altered perceptions in their bodies with intense visualization and sensations occurring in them. There was coldness and shivering and heat or the wish to dance. Several reported the feeling that their bodies changed from a battlefield between cancer and chemotherapy in order to being a source of great pleasure and expansion. And a number of our patients also talked about visualizing ridding their bodies of cancer energy or the visual representations that they had of cancer, and felt that this was a kind of exorcism of the spirit of cancer, along with the ways that the medical treatment was removing the cancer from their bodies. One participant, a young man, had an experience of his body melting away, muscle, bone, everything. This was a 17-year-old who was diagnosed with leukemia during his senior year of college. He was ready to go into a soccer scholarship, and during his senior year, everything changed. And the transformation in his body was really a profound experience for him. He soon found himself during his journey setting out. He was an incarnate soul on a journey to find another body. He soon found himself in a department store that was offering new bodies. And it turns out that they really only had one on the rack. But luckily, it was his. So it fit him perfectly. And this narrative, he told us after his session, it really happened to him. And this was an immense source of pleasure for him. And he experienced being reborn into his healthy body. You know, when we were working with him, his body was healthy, but he still felt that it was ill. He still felt the damage and the cachexia, the loss of weight, and the weakness that happened to him when he was ill, even though he was cancer-free. And in fact, that's why he was admitted to the study. Although he was not terminal in any way, he still was intensely preoccupied with the effects of his having cancer. He was a 17-year-old college senior who was a soccer player with a scholarship when he was diagnosed, and his cancer stripped him of his healthy body. And even though he was free of cancer, he never experienced his spirit body as being restored until this psychedelic therapy session. So as you can hear, it would be a real challenge to deliver a narrative like this to a cancer clinician. And yet, I think that we have to find some way to begin introducing these narratives of what intoxication with a psychedelic that's used in a constructive way like this can really mean. And so I want to close the section on intoxication with this quote from Cameron Duff. And it's a little wordy, but I think it captures something so well, I want to read it slowly. About intoxication. These corporeal and performative practices open up an experience of difference in which new iterations of the self and subjectivity are made possible. The individuals experience this otherness as profoundly exciting, and pleasure is confirmed again and again in the words that they use to describe this experience. So what could be a more elegant explanation of what we hope that a psychedelic healing session can be for somebody with cancer? Okay, so now we're going to tackle dissociation. So maybe we've made some headway into thinking about how intoxication might be potentially therapeutic or adaptive. We need to move on to an even darker anxiety for many humanistic clinicians, and that's dissociation. Dissociation, whether it's a shy, mute patient looking off in the distance and not speaking to you, or a Pentecostal snake handler who is in an ecstatic state of arousal, dissociation is held as a deeply pathological narrative in the culture of psychoanalysis, psychology, and psychiatry. And here we have three of the most famous dissociators, Three Faces of Eve, Sybil, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So I eliminated a couple of slides here because, in the interest of time, so I'm just going to speak quite briefly about it. Dissociation historically was first written about by Pierre Janet in the mid to late 1800s, who worked with hysteria patients in France. Now, he wrote extensively about dissociation, but he didn't think it was a psychological defense. He thought it was an effect of brain degeneration, that it had an organic basis. And Freud, when learning from Genet, really turned away from dissociation and was much more interested in repression. And with repression, there is one self, and memories get buried and buried and buried, and then you unearth them. Dissociation is when the self splits, in more like a vertical way to multiple selves. And this was not really appealing or interesting to Freud. And so dissociation really fell out of favor as a way of thinking about patients clinically until the 60s and 70s. And it was in the 70s that we had a return of Vietnam veterans with PTSD. And dissociation became a core symptom of PTSD, and so suddenly psychiatrists and psychoanalysts were writing about it and thinking about it a lot. The other way that the dissociation came into the public consciousness was the horrific emergence of untold amounts of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse of children that came out in the 80s. I don't know if any of the clinicians here are older, you might remember that there was this eruption of satanic cult abuse. And it turns out that many that many of these stories were actually fabricated, and there was a whole false memory syndrome. But as a result of the emergence of how much sexual and physical abuse was uncovered that had been previously denied, we saw much more dissociative pathology. And so again, these two problems, the abuse, sexual abuse of children, and the emergence of PTSD brought dissociation into public awareness, or into sort of analytic and psychiatric awareness. It became the defense of choice. Before that, we had PTSD. It used to be called shell shock, or soldier's heart, or combat fatigue. But those did not have dissociation as the hypothesized mechanism. Those had much more, again, degenerative models in them, that the person's brain was somehow weakened in some way, rather than the dissociation. So dissociation got a new life, and I like to try to define what dissociation is in the psychiatric and psychoanalytic model. Dissociation is a lack of normal integration of thoughts, feelings, and experiences. It isn't that they're not there, it's that a person can have various thoughts, feelings, and experiences in this iteration, and then another iteration, they would have different thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Or they may be awake and alert and speaking to you, and yet, in 4 hours, not have any recall for what they had thought or felt or said. So the central self is lost in dissociation. There is detachment from physical surroundings. Consciousness can have a dreamlike quality. Two core symptoms of dissociation are derealization and depersonalization. In derealization, the world around you does not feel real. It is not recognizable as real. You say, I know it looks real, but it's not. That's not the real world. And in depersonalization, this is the same process applied to the self. I am not myself. I am alien to myself. I don't recognize myself. I am other. I am not the person that I used to be or that I thought I was. Often in dissociation, there's amnesia, which involves not remembering significant periods of time, even though seeming to be awake. With a fugue state, a person can completely lose their identity and not know who they are, or assume a new identity. And with dissociative identity disorder, which is what used to be called multiple personality disorder, we have fragmentation of identity into completely separate streams of consciousness, where a person has memory, affect, a kinesthetic sense, and an identity, which is quite separate from another, and they don't have co-consciousness or creation or communication with one another. So this is clearly a highly pathological condition. It in psychiatry is caused by trauma, and it is a result of trauma as well. So dissociation is a strategy for coping with extreme trauma and a consequence of the trauma as well. Dissociation is seen as an interference with normal brain function and normal psychological functioning. We're supposed to have one identity. It's supposed to be coherent. It's supposed to be consistent from one day to the next. Pathological dissociation is uncontrollable and involuntary. It's brought on by stress or by some kind of trigger that evokes it. Its purpose is to protect the individual from being overwhelmed and to evade awareness of painful perceptions, emotions, and behaviors, and to evade past traumas that would otherwise haunt memory and to escape from reality. So you can see that dissociation is completely embedded in a pathological model, and the idea that dissociation might be helpful or creative is really nowhere in this structure. So in short, the dissociated person is fragmented, cannot function in society, has been traumatized, suffers greatly, and needs treatment in order to bring him or her back to becoming an integrated whole person. But there are two problems with this narrative. One is that normative dissociation happens quite frequently, and the other is that there is adaptive extreme dissociation. So healthy people dissociate every day. In fact, it's normal to be able to dissociate. Mild dissociation can be outer directed when you're watching a movie or reading a book, listening to music or studying, or it may be inner directed with daydreaming, reverie, and fantasy. Mild dissociation is characterized by being easily left and entered. Memory is retained. It's finite in time, and it actually may facilitate functioning. People who cannot daydream, who cannot enter reverie, people who cannot change from one state to another, when you go home from work, if you can't let go of what's happening at work and change to being at home, that's a problem. So not being able to dissociate is a kind of rigidity that people actually seek treatment for. And in normative dissociation, marked identity disruption is not present. So on the left, we have milder dissociation in everyday life. It can be entered spontaneously through fantasy or daydreaming, or you can pursue it in a formal way with hypnotic states or meditation, exercise, sex, and prayer. And on the right, we have some examples of more extreme types of dissociation that are voluntarily entered and sought for particular purposes, including religious ecstatic states, visionary shamanic states, and states that are induced by markedly heightened or restricted stimulation or self-induced painful states. So let's take a look at ayahuasca shamanism and dissociative states evoked by either by medicine intoxication or even without medicine to enter spirit communication. First of all, the ayahuasca shaman is socially sanctioned by his or her community to enter these states and is not a patient. The shaman voluntarily enters these states of dissociation and these trance and are currently not a trauma victim or an ill person. We talked about earlier today, there may be trauma or there may be illness that are part of the initial shamanic calling, but that when functioning, the person who is entering into this dissociated state is not an ill person, but in fact is a healer. And more importantly, the shaman enters in order to access information that is ordinarily not available rather than to escape it. And the purpose is to benefit others, not the self. So let's take a look at the list of dissociation, features of dissociation that I described before. And I'm going to invite you to imagine how this dissociative process might be seen, understood, and given a different narrative when understood in terms of psychedelic consciousness or shamanic experience. So the lack of integration of normal integration of thoughts, feelings, and experiences. We generally like our people to be integrated, to have one personality, and to be fully present. In some ways, this is seen as the highest form of consciousness, alert, attentive, and focused. But this expansion of ordinary consciousness is, in a different context, much more adaptive for certain kinds of purposes. So with the loss of a central self, in shamanic healing, you see shape-shifting, identification with spirit, animal, and ancestors. So the self, the identity of the shaman becomes less present and goes into a kind of eclipse, and there is this radical identification with spirit, ancestors, animals, or other processes that are happening. consciousness having a dreamlike quality, you certainly see a great deal of dream metaphor and the journey that a shaman would take as a dream. In derealization and depersonalization, you see these same things again. The ordinary real world is seen as unreal, and the imaginal psychedelically induced dissociated world is reported to be realer than real. And the imaginal realm is seen as another layer of reality that actually has more truth in it and has a more felt sense of truth than what we see in ordinary consensual reality. So in depersonalization, we see it as pathological when somebody doesn't recognize himself and feels alien to himself, and yet the shamanic path is taking on or assuming personalities of animal spirits or identities of ancestors in order to communicate with them or to understand them in a different way. This fugue state and loss of identity, again, these are seen through spirit possession and soul retrieval, where it isn't just like the shaman going and fetching it like something at a store. This occurs through an identification and an empathic immersion with the spirit. So it's not just seeing the spirit, it's being with and identifying with and having an empathic connection to spirit. And so I listed before the purpose of shamanic trance, the purpose of dissociation and the ways that it pulled power and diminished the individual. In shamanic trance, the purpose is to gain power and knowledge for the community, to predict and diagnose illness, and to treat illness by playing a complex and theatrical role. So, what is the shaman's social prerogative? What is the social responsibility as a result of his or her dissociative trance? First, the shaman is required and expected to say what is wrong and to say what is right, to divide and to label. The shaman is expected to know about entities and sorcerers, who is good and who is evil, and how to intervene. To know how to find lost spirits or banished ones that have taken possession or that won't leave. To understand how problems are multi-generational and embedded in the community, and to know that all problematic relationships with nature or in nature are the root of difficulties, and that healing them is a source of wholeness. And lastly, to metamorphose and to shapeshift, to become spirit. So it's not just seeing spirits, but the shaman is invited to see as spirits see. And in some ways, this brings us full circle to what is at the core of a significant core of psychoanalytic theory, and that is the process of radical empathy, to see as the other sees, not to see them, but to see as they see, and to let them be seen by you in their way of seeing you. So this radical empathy is a healing process in psychoanalysis, and it is a core part of what I believe results from the shamanic process of dissociation. So I'd like to wrap up tonight by talking about how some of these ideas can be applied to what I saw in working with participants in our studies.